Hello and welcome to Sam Not So Wise. My name is Sam. It's February, so it's time to wrap up those first reads of 2025 and what I read in January. Now, I read 4 books in January, not the most, but also quite decent considering my life at the moment. They were quite chunky books as well, so there is that to consider, but I have absolutely no idea how people read 8+ books in a month. I know a lot of those people probably do audio, but I'm still not even sure when I would squeeze audio into my life. But anyway, that's beside the point. I did start university, just starting my 3rd degree in January on my birthday, which was very fun. So that is obviously taking up a lot of my time. So I really have been squeezing these books in. One of them was a buddy read and one was for my book club that I run. So that really did kind of force me to read as much as possible, which I'm grateful for, even if it was difficult at times. So I think that's everything for the intro. So with much further ado, let's talk about those first reads of 2025. So the first book that I read in January was The Green Mile by Stephen King, one of my favorite authors. This is the 16th book I think I've read by him. Now, King is often spoke of as this horror writer, which I contest. I mean, yes, he wrote a lot of horror, but he also wrote a lot of stuff. And this is a perfect example of a non-horror story by Stephen King. Now, you probably have heard of this. A lot of people know of this from the film adaptation, which I haven't watched, but I've heard is a very faithful adaptation and a very good film. I really want to watch it. So what is this about? If you don't know the story, this is a story of a death row prison with particular focus on one of the characters within this prison on his way to the chair, as he is accused of the deaths of 2 young girls. But it is also very much a story about the head warden of this prison and his life in general, but also very much on the block of this prison and the other inmates that he's experienced over his time, with particular attention paid to the ones close to this main character, who is called John Coffey, by the way. Now, we eventually start to learn more about Coffey's story and the truth of his incarceration and the story moves from there without any spoilers. Now, there is one small supernatural element within this story, which is kind of common for Stephen King. I would still call this kind of a contemporary fiction rather than fantasy or magical realism. I mean, maybe magical realism, but I'm not really sure what that means in reality, which impacts one of our main characters. There is also a mouse as a character, a very smart mouse. And this seems like it would be really cheesy, but it is actually done brilliantly. I love that mouse, Mr. Jingles. You gotta love Mr. Jingles. And it's just amazing how Stephen King can get you attached to a little mouse. But that's what he's like. He's a character writer. And talking of characters, this is a character book. It's kind of a pretty slow story. It's not that, heart pumping in action or anything like that. As always with King, it's just about the characters, and you get to know everybody on this block in this kind of time or close to the time, the prisoners and the people who work there. Excuse me. And you learn to love or hate many of them. There is one extremely memorable scene which would probably go into the horror genre, I guess. It is horrific, but it's not that kind of horror. Like, when I spoke to my wife about the film, she said she'd seen it and she's like, I remember one particular scene, and I was like, is it this scene? And she's like, yes. So extremely memorable scene that will be burnt into your memory for a long time. This book is full of themes. Stephen King is good at writing themes. It's all about the morality of the death sentence, quite obviously, but also very much about empathy, power-hungry abusers, potentially a bit of psychopathy, and friendship. So I absolutely loved The Green Mile. Stephen King is just such an excellent writer. He really grabs you with his characters and his theme work. And this was an excellent example of non-horror Stephen King, and I highly recommend you pick it up. It was about just under 600 pages, so not like one of his ridiculously long books. So something that you can easily pick up and read. And You will feel emotion. I was tearing up at the end because it is quite a sad story in the end, but it does have a lot of beauty. So a big recommend from me. The next book I read was Cage of Souls by Adrian Tchaikovsky, another one of my favorite authors, at least one of my favorite authors. And this was the 6th book that I've read by him. And this was the first disappointment that I've read by him. The other 5 books were all good to amazing. This one was just quite meh for me. It may not be for you, but it was kind of a slog for me to get through these 600 pages. So what is it about? Well, from one prison to another. This is kind of mostly a prison story, but this time set in a post-apocalyptic world, a very scientific sci-fi post-apocalyptic world. So it's a story told from a perspective from the future, looking back, first person, kind of like formal journal entries, not like writing a diary as you're going along, but him looking back and writing formal entries on his story. Now this starts the story by describing him on his way to this prison. It's a remote prison in the middle of nowhere where basically nobody ever leaves, nobody escapes. This is basically a long death sentence and kind of slave labor. Now we follow his story as he negotiates his life in this brutal place and tries to basically survive as long as possible. The world setting is one of Earth on its last legs. There's one city left and this prison, and everything else is unlivable on the whole planet. Eventually this main character, Stefan, starts learning strange things about the surroundings of this prison and more about the world. And we're also given a lot of flashbacks as we learn how he got to this prison, how he got to be incarcerated, basically. Now, my issues with this book, one thing is it's kind of the first person looking back story. I never truly felt like he was in danger because, you know, we know that he survives. This is kind of just a problem I have with a lot of these kind of stories, is it doesn't ramp up the tension that much because we know he's going to survive even though he's in this horrible place. So you kind of expect him to escape eventually. Now his character, he is like the luckiest man in the world. He's got more lives than a cat. Like, he is self-admittedly a coward, yet he always managed to escape these like almost guaranteed death situations on so many occasions, and I just found it rather unbelievable. You might enjoy this lucky person trope, but for me it was hard to suspend my disbelief. Now the writing style, Tchaikovsky can be like this a little at times, but it was just a bit slow and dry for me. I don't mind slow stories, but it just felt extremely plodding and dry. It felt like a historical account rather than a fun story. It was just a lot of times of exposition and not much dialogue, and it just didn't flow much for me. You might enjoy the style, but it just wasn't that fun for me. There was nothing really to hold on to, so there are so many sci-fi concepts that he talks about, you know, just the apocalypse, for example, ancient tech, I love that trope, rapid evolution, robot people, body transformation, time travel, and so much more, but he never really delves into any of them for more than just a few pages. I really would have preferred it if we could have picked a few and delved into them deeper, but it wasn't to be. So maybe again that would be something you enjoy, but I prefer to delve into things a little more. The characters, you never really get an extended amount of time with side characters, mostly because a lot of them die off. So if you don't really like the main character, then there's nobody else that you're gonna latch onto. And to be honest, Stefan, the main character, is kind of beige, is kind of bland. So this just wasn't for me. It might be for you, but it was just a bit of a slog for me. It doesn't mean that I don't want to read any more Tchaikovsky. I want to read so much more Tchaikovsky, and with the amount he churns out, there was always going to be one or two disappointments in his works, and this was the first for me. So Cage of Souls, not the best for me, but I'm looking forward to reading more Tchaikovsky in the future. The next book that I read was the one that was picked for the book club that I run here in Reykjavik, and we're moving from one post-apocalyptic story to another, so a lot of linking in January, and that was Wool by Hugh Howey, the first book in the Silo trilogy. I'd heard mixed receptions about this book before going into it, probably due to the expectations on the book, maybe from watching the TV series or not knowing how the book is structured. Because this book is a fix-up novel of 1 short story and 4 novellas, and I believe the series continues in a similar vein. Now, it's somewhat difficult to talk about the plot of this book because it is quite episodic in nature, but the stories do link up in certain ways. So maybe a side character from one story will become the main focus in the next, and the cohesion develops as we stick with some characters for longer as the book moves along. Now, this story is about a huge underground silo, hence the name of the series. And people live there in this post-apocalyptic future, hundreds of years in the future. We don't actually know how long, where the outside is so contaminated that it means certain death if you leave the silo. Now, the silo itself has a functioning society where everything is provided for, but there are very specific rules within this silo, such as the use of goods, and there is population control as well. An interesting feature is that if you question why they are there or why they are doing things, or if you delve into the history of the silo too deep, this leads you to something called cleaning, which basically means getting kicked out of the silo and instant death. So very much a dystopian society in many ways. We see a couple of people get sent to cleaning and more people start asking questions, which is leading up to a lot of upheaval within this silo, and mysteries are coming to light of the dirty deeds that are going on underneath the facade of this great society. Now, I actually really enjoyed the structure of this book. Some people may not enjoy this kind of episodic nature, but I felt like it gave the story a real momentum, and it was just really easy to read and keep reading with the shorter stories. Now, the book starts with a real bang. The first story is the short story, and it's just an incredibly moving short story full of twists and turns in such a short page count. It really got me eager to read more. So a very impressive beginning. Now, the characters, considering the nature of the episodic story, it's surprising how well done the characterization is. And this obviously grows as we stick with the characters longer as the book develops, but I really enjoyed a lot of the characters. And we do lose a lot of characters as well, so it is quite moving and sad at times. Now, this book had a lot more thematic work than I was expecting, which I really enjoyed. It's absolutely packed full of thematic work, such as censorship and the manipulation of history, political corruption, class structures, human hubris, and the strength of communities, plus many, many more. Now, I thought this was a great book. Story-wise, it can sometimes be somewhat predictable, maybe a little bit tropey at times, but there were a lot of nice surprises, and it had a lot of heart, and it had a lot to think about. So I really enjoyed this, and I'll definitely be reading the rest of the series some point in the near future. So the fourth and final book I'll talk about was a buddy read with Whitney from Secret Source of Storycraft and Bart from Bart's Book Space. This is the second buddy read we've done, the first one being Use of Weapons by Ian M. Banks, which was such a fun time, and we had another brilliant time reading this book. We'll probably have a chat about it at some point, a video chat led by me this time, and I'll put that out in a few weeks. I don't really know, we haven't talked about it because we've only just finished the book, and the book is The Algebraist by Ian M. Banks, another Banks book. Now, if you followed my channel at all, you know that Banks is my favorite author of all time. I've read all of the culture books, but this was the first one I've read that is a sci-fi book not set in the culture. I was a little bit nervous that it wasn't going to live up to his standards, especially as nobody ever talks about this book. But I had nothing to worry about. This was absolutely bloody brilliant as always. I'll give you a gist of the plot, but it's quite difficult to go into details because it is a huge book in size, but also in terms of story and sci-fi elements. Now, the world is the Milky Way, set in about 2,000 years, and the galaxy is fully inhabited by humans and advanced aliens of a wide variety. The galaxy is also full of history, of rises and falls, of civilizations, often defined by whether wormholes are a technology that is happening at the time. So it really depends on the speed of travel. It's also a world where AI has existed but has mostly been exterminated, and there are a few bands of people trying to find the remnant AIs and destroy them because they're seen as highly dangerous. Now, the focus of the story is of a scholar. He lives on a moon of a gas giant, and he is studying a largely secretive but also galaxy-spanning species of aliens who live in these gas giants all across the galaxy and have been around for billions of years. They've seen it all, they've lived through everything, and they are still going strong, but they're very, very secretive. Meanwhile, a psychopathic head of a galactic empire is making its way to this very system to wage a devastating war. So there's very much a time concept going on. The galaxy's kind of leading power consortium informed this scholar called Fassin of this coming fleet, but also a secret, telling him it has something to do with a seemingly innocuous piece of info that he found at some point in his previous research. Nothing that he knew was important. It's a tech secret kept by the dwellers, who are the people that live in these gas giants. They immediately promote him to a high level of power and basically force him to go into this gas giant and find out more about this secret that everybody wants to know. It's a race against time, as I said, to find this information before the war host arrives. That's all I'm going to say, because otherwise I'll be going into spoilers, of course. Now, Banks, he is the master. He's a master storyteller. This book has everything in it. The storytelling itself, he just knows how to spin a yarn. It's masterfully introducing plots, parts of plots from different perspectives at different times, providing just the right level of intrigue and suspense at the right time. He just really knows how to write a story and fit it together to make it really interesting. Now, his imagination, I've talked about this before, his world building is just immense. The galaxy really does feel lived in and with a great big history. The aliens in this book are just fascinating, and there are a lot of them. They feel very well realized. Their societies feel real and believable. The main aliens that we focus on, the dwellers of the gas giants, they are a truly unique example of these aliens. I mean, just the fact that they live in gas giants and just their perspectives and the secrets they keep, having lived for so long and seen so many rises and falls of civilizations. They're very blasé to what the humans are doing, basically. Now, the characters, the main character, Fassin, he's an interesting character with many layers. And also I feel like the side characters are quite varied and interesting as well. My only quibble would be that the main antagonist, who is called Luciferus, is maybe a little bit mustache twirly. I found him interesting to begin with, but then he was just the most awful person, and it just, I liked him, but it just felt a little bit mustache twirly. Some people might not like him as a character. I still liked him, but you might not. Now, humor, there's always humor in Banks's book, and so it was always going to be here, and it always lands. It's brilliant, and it always just comes at such amazing times. You're just kind of not expecting it. A lot of the humor is done through these dwellers, these gas giant aliens, from their perspective, because it's just kind of a very unique perspective, and it just seems funny to us at times. Now, there is thematic work within this. It's maybe not the main focus, but it is there to keep you going if you like theme-driven work, such as persecution and the spinning of the narrative of history and changing it to your needs, balance of power, and the importance of knowledge. Now, I will say this is not a book for beginners of sci-fi. You might want to get into some easier space opera before you get into this absolute beast of a book. But it was absolutely brilliant. Banks is just a master storyteller. So much fun, so much depth, lots of philosophizing, great characters, great world building. This is not going to make Banks go down in my estimate at all. I love him so much. Please read The Algebraist. Nobody's talking about it. Just to wrap up the reading section of this video, I'll tell you what I read for my course because I am doing an English degree. There is one literature module in this term. It's American literature of the 19th century, and we're reading basically a lot of short stories and going through the century. So I read 2 short stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne, somebody I had not heard of before, and they were The Minister's Veil and Rappaccini's Daughter. And I was very surprised at how much I enjoyed these short stories. They were quite odd in a way, with very quirky characters, quite fun to read, allegorical in nature, and I'm just very interested in reading more. I've heard of one of his books called The Scarlet Letter, so I'm very interested in reading that. That was a really fun reading experience for me. The next was Edgar Allan Poe. I read 3 of his short stories, The Cask of Amontillado, The Purloined Letter, and The Oval Portrait. Now, I don't really have much to say about these. They were kind of nothing stories to me. I'm not sure how representative of his works they are, but they weren't as interesting to me as the Hawthorne stories. The Purloined Letter was kind of interesting in a way because it's kind of a proto-investigator story, which is interesting to see like the history of it before you get something like an Agatha Christie novel or Sherlock Holmes, something like that. And that's it. I'm only doing the 1 literature module. I've had lots of assignments already, lectures and academic reading. So I'm looking forward to reading more and doing more literature modules further in the degree. Lastly, I'll whip through my TBR for February. Obviously, February is a shorter month, so there's less reading time. I've also got 6 exams in February, plus other assignments, plus other reading, plus lectures, plus work, blah, blah, blah. So it's going to be a squeeze to fit in some books, but let's talk about them. One I'm definitely going to read is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is my priority series for the year. I'm just waiting for it to arrive because it's hard to get books in this country, in Iceland. So I'm told that it's going to come in the middle of the month, but that is a priority for me. I'm definitely going to be reading that. One that I'll be starting tonight is We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. I always want to say Zevgeny for some reason. Then this is kind of like the precursor dystopian novel to like my favorite book, 1984. I know that George Orwell sees this as a big inspiration for that book. So I'm super, super excited to read this as I love dystopian fiction. Yes. Next, we have Ghost Written by David Mitchell. I'm very keen to read more Mitchell. I've read 3 of his, loved 2, didn't really like one of the others, so I'm really looking forward to reading more of him. If I have time, which I don't think I will, but hopefully I will, if I have time, I'm going to start Shift, the 2nd book in the Silo trilogy, because I really did enjoy Wool. So that will be the next one. It being like novellas is maybe a good way of splitting up these books. We'll see how it goes. So those are my plans for February. So that's it for today's video. If you've made it this far into the video, I thank you so much. It really helps if people watch the whole video to push my videos into the algorithm. It's not a big concern, but it's always nice to get the views. I would love to know if you've read any of these books and what you think about them. Let me know what you've been reading as well. I'm always interested to hear and get into some conversations in the comments. If you liked the video, please consider liking. If you're new to the channel, also consider subscribing and joining my journey here. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching again, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.